Good afternoon. Welcome from the Vienna Institute of Demography. It's my pleasure to give you a short talk on low fertility and population dynamics in Europe, focusing also on the challenges and policy options in small countries in Europe. The discussions and also policymakers' attention in the last decades in many European countries have focused on a number of worries and challenges related to population aging, its consequences, low fertility, unfolding population declines in some countries of Europe, and also to substantial outmigration or immigration across many places in Europe. The surveys show that a relatively high number of people in many European countries worry about both emigration and its impact on their societies, pension systems, labor market, but also about immigration and the migrant impact on host societies and their integration. So migration clearly has become an important force in European demographic trends, but also in the discussion surrounding them. This is in a nutshell the agenda of topics I will cover in my short talk, focusing especially on fertility trends, their drivers and consequences, but also on migration and how migration is shaping the divides in population trends between the East and the West of Europe. Let me now turn to fertility trends. About 2 decades ago, Europe was divided between countries with relatively higher levels of fertility, mostly the Nordic countries and Western European countries such as France and the United Kingdom, and most of the other regions of Europe with relatively low levels of fertility, which pertained also to the formerly state socialist countries of Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe, which experienced substantial drops in their fertility rates after the transition from state socialist system to market economies. However, during and after the Great Recession and during the COVID-19 pandemic, fertility rates declined in many parts of Europe, especially in countries which used to have relatively higher fertility rates, so that today, in 2025, most European countries and regions have low fertility rates at around similar range, with total fertility rates around 1.3, 1.4, with even lower levels reached in Southern European countries and a few other places, including Poland. Slovenia has quite a specific position in fertility trends when compared with its neighbors and with the Central European region at large. Slovenia had comparatively low fertility rates in 1990 at the start of the post-socialist transition, and it experienced relatively robust recovery in fertility rates after the year 2000, partly fueled by strong family policies or helped by strong family policies in Slovenia. The recent fertility decline, which occurred across most higher and middle income countries, also outside Europe, at the later stage of the COVID-19 pandemic and in the post-COVID period, was more modest in Slovenia than in most other countries, so that Slovenia today has comparatively higher fertility rates than its neighbors and than European countries at large. Looking at fertility trends from the perspective of cohort fertility rates of the generation of women born in 1982, Europe is still relatively clearly divided between low and very low fertility regions, especially Southern European countries, and a number of countries in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, including Ukraine and Poland, and the higher fertility parts of Europe, such as France, Britain, Norway, the Nordic countries, with Slovenia occupying approximately the middle position, close to the EU average of a fertility rate or family size, average family size of 1.65 children per woman. A pervasive trend which goes hand in hand in fertility declines of the last decade has been the shift towards ever later timing of parenthood across European countries, but also across other higher and middle income countries, which started in the richest parts of Europe already in the 1970s. Today, parents in Slovenia, or women in Slovenia, became mothers on average around the age of 30, as much as in the rest of Europe, with some countries such as Spain and outside Europe in South Korea, first mothers becoming even women becoming first mothers even at older ages, around 32 or 33. The shift in the timing of parenthood means that more and more women are remaining childless in the mid-30s, when infertility starts increasing and when the chance of realizing fertility plans start to decline. In the case of Spain and outside Europe, in Japan, 4 out of 10 women in their mid-30s at age 35 remain childless today, and we know from the surveys that many of them still plan to have children in the future. However, it will be difficult for many of them to realize their fertility plans, as some of them will face infertility or will change their preferences or will not find a suitable partner for having children with. So shrinking future reproductive window for some women and couples postponing parenthood to higher ages is one of the future challenges. We also know that younger generations today have different ways of leaving parental home, dating, engaging in intimate life, and in partnering. Generation Z today is clearly slower in getting into partnership and parenthood, but also into home living. And we know from the evidence for a number of countries, including Finland, that decreasing marriage and cohabitation rates, but also higher rates of divorce and union dissolution are contributing to the observed fertility decline in the last 15 years. But going beyond changes in partnership behaviors, home living, and partnering, we also know there are structural factors which partly explain the current fertility declines. In many parts of Europe, with declining fertility rates in the last 15 years, young adults have faced stagnating incomes compared to the older generations in the decade since the Great Recession, including the times in the mid-2010s when the economies were seemingly recovering, unemployment rates were very low, but at the same time, the income situation of younger people wasn't improving. And we also know at the same time, housing prices started increasing in many big cities, making housing unaffordable for many young adults. Putting this into a yet broader perspective, young adults today are more worrying about the future than the previous generations. They're worrying about their employment and income prospects, but they are also worrying more broadly about a host of unfolding crises, the climate change, the wars and conflicts, and the rapid change in the economic outlook, most recently including also potential future impact of artificial intelligence. And we also know that when people are worrying about the future, they may tend to postpone childbearing towards later ages or have fewer children than in times when they look at the future with more optimism. At the same time, many young people today perceive having kids as a relatively big burden, mentioning difficult responsibilities, higher standards for what does it mean to be a good parent. They mention that parenthood limits freedom, is difficult to combine with work. This example is an evidence from a rich European country, Norway, where younger people in their late 20s have more negative views of parenthood than somewhat older generations on average. So we are now facing conditions where young people are not only facing new economic constraints, but also have a different outlook on parenthood. With some research, which is still in the very early stage of development, also dealing with potential impact of social media and digital technologies on this on this new views on parenthood. We also know from surveys that more young people than in the past express uncertainty whether they want to become parents in the future. Many people, both women and men, in their 20s say they are uncertain whether they want to have children in the future, as in this example of a generation and gender survey in Austria. This is quite a different situation compared with the surveys a few decades ago, which suggested that a large majority of young people were planning and intending to have children in the future. Going beyond fertility trends, it's also important to highlight how migration is reshaping European societies. Europe as a continent has experienced an increasing number of people who are born in different countries, today reaching almost 100 million Europeans born in a different country. This increase has been faster than in other continents, and Europe is the continent with the highest number of migrants globally today. But these migrants are not equally distributed across the continent, leading to different population trends across different countries. Especially countries in the east and southeast of Europe, including most of the Balkans, have experienced substantial outmigration in the last 3 decades, whereas the richer parts of Europe, including southern European countries, have experienced a lot of immigration, and this migration divide resulted in relatively robust population growth continuing in many richer parts of Europe, despite their low fertility rates. But it also contributed to huge population declines in the poorer parts of Europe, including countries such as Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Romania, Latvia, and Lithuania, losing a substantial share of their population. Corresponding to that are huge divides across Europe in the share of foreign-born population, ranging from around 30% of people in Switzerland to a very limited little share like 2% in Albania and 1% in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And clearly, these differences in migration, outmigration from poor parts of Europe, immigration to richer parts of Europe, have contributed to European population divides in population growth or decline, which has had little to do with low fertility rates and was much more fueled, driven by outmigration and immigration in the past decade. What does this mean from a longer-term perspective for smaller and middle-sized countries in Europe? Again, it means that countries face very different demographic trajectories. Slovenia is actually an example of a country which has seen relatively moderate population increase in the last 3 decades, driven by relatively stable, although relatively low fertility rates, and moderate immigration rates. Looking at the UN population projection until the end of this century, Slovenian population is expected to peak in about 1 or 2 decades and then gradually decline to about 1.6 million by the end of the century. Compared with some other countries which have experienced substantial outmigration, such as Latvia or Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is actually a kind of very positive development, because those countries which have seen substantial outmigration in the past decade today have relatively few people of reproductive ages, combined with relatively low levels of fertility and combined with higher mortality rates than in other parts of Europe. In the long-term future, this means places like Latvia or Bosnia and Herzegovina will experience much faster population declines than Slovenia, as clearly shown in this picture. This graph summarizes some of the differences across smaller and middle-sized European countries today, comparing Slovenia with Austria to the north, with Czechia, which is very similar in many demographic trends, but also with Latvia and Bulgaria, which have seen substantial amount of outmigration in the last decades. And the interesting thing in this comparison is that while the total fertility rates on average were very similar across these 5 countries, these 5 countries have seen very different population change in the last 25 years, with Austria experiencing population increase by 15% on the one hand, and Latvia and Bulgaria losing more than 20%, 1/5 of their population. And the main driver of that, again, was, as I mentioned earlier, the difference in migration, with Latvia and Bulgaria experiencing relatively large levels of outmigration, Czechia and Slovenia modest immigration, and Austria stronger immigration rate. This has been mirrored also in their trends in the number of births, because migrants typically boost population of productive and reproductive ages, and despite not having much higher fertility rates than native women, they contribute to a higher number of births or slower decline in the number of births in these societies. So what policy adjustments do we need to deal with the looming population changes and trends, some of which I discussed in my presentation? One important thing to realize is that the future population change will differ by context. Even within European countries, we have huge differences between major urban areas, which often serve as magnets of migration, both internal and international, and centers of economic activities, high income, with high share of highly educated population on the one hand, and more peripheral rural areas with rapidly aging and often shrinking population on the other hand, which presents huge challenges in how these societies should adjust and also focus their policies on these aging and depopulating areas, dealing with challenges around infrastructure, service provisions, elderly care, and so on and so forth. In terms of family policies, we need to develop more holistic policies with different policy packages aligned with each other. I think Slovenia is an example of one of the countries with very well developed and strong family support policies, but still more could be done. More could be done, for instance, in pushing for more flexible parental leaves, giving it more flexibility in parents in deciding when do they stay at home with their children, providing a stronger financial support to both parents, and making it easy for mothers and fathers to alternate in childcare during parental leave, giving them maximum level of flexibility. I think addressing housing shortages and affordability is a very difficult task for the governments today. More broadly, supporting young adults in the realization of their fertility and labor market aspirations is an important policy agenda. One has to realize that many people are planning to realize their fertility plans at later reproductive ages. Providing them information and access to assisted reproduction is important as well. And last but not least, we have to think more about localized policies, how cities and regions can become more family and child-friendly. What can companies and firms do for families and people planning to have children and provide them the best working conditions to combine their work, career, and family aspirations. So we need to develop a new family policy paradigm where people and governments are not talking about crises and scare effect, blaming women or young people for low fertility, but rather developing positive, nurturing vision of the future centered on well-being, but also accepting that fertility rates will not reach replacement level, that they will not be substantially higher than they are today, because today's young generations are planning smaller family size than the previous generations. That means our societies also need a host of broader economic, labor market, and social adjustments, which include a lot of adjustments around labor market, making work life course more flexible, making retirement more flexible, providing a host of policies which tap the potential of elderly employees and supporting labor market integration of migrants, young adults, mothers, and the elderly who want to continue working longer. We need to promote active and healthy aging, but we also need to devise rational immigration policies which are partly tailored to the societal and labor market needs. We need to reshape our social support, healthcare, and elderly care system, and we need to adjust our societies to very rapid technological changes, tapping the potential of artificial intelligence and automation to cope with the shrinking labor force. To conclude, demographic research shows that population aging is an inevitable force in Europe because we are living longer and healthier lives, which is overall a positive development. Neither migration, nor fertility, nor higher fertility have the potential to stop the trend towards higher shares of the elderly population, but they can partly mitigate this trend and they can contribute to keeping a larger share of labor force of population in the productive age and in labor force. Maybe even more important is to think about the policies tapping the potential of women and men who are not in the labor force and supporting further increases in education and training, because we know that highly educated people, especially women, are more often in the labor force than the lower educated one, and that they are earning more, paying more in taxes, and remaining healthier and engaged in the labor force later in life. In other words, if the European Union countries would be able to achieve equal participation of women and men and a shift towards more highly educated population with stronger labor force participation, the EU working age population participating in the labor force would become more or less the same as today in the year 2060, which is, I hope, a positive news. Thank you very much for your attention.